Insomnia is a ghost that haunts the guilty, but in my case, it stalked the old. I lay in the center of the king-size bed that felt more like a tomb since Eleanor died 3 years ago, staring at the ceiling where water stains traced the shapes of imaginary continents. The house was silent, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the heavy, pregnant silence of a place holding its breath, waiting for the structural beams to finally give way under the weight of the secrets accumulating in the corners. I am Thomas Sterling. I spent 40 years wearing black robes and sitting on a bench elevated 3 feet above the rest of the world. I was a district judge. I determined the fate of strangers based on evidence, precedent, and the subtle tells of a liar. I could spot perjury in the twitch of an eyelid or the hesitation before a denial. I built a career, a reputation, and a small fortune on seeing the truth that others tried to hide. But I was blind to the lies sleeping under my own roof. My son, Caleb, and his wife, Julianne, had moved in 6 months ago. They came with boxes of clothes and promises of care. To help, they said, their eyes shining with a concern that felt almost genuine. To keep you company, they promised, holding my hand with grips that were just a little too tight. It didn't take long for the help to turn into surveillance and the company to turn into containment. They treated my Victorian home not as a sanctuary, but as a waiting room for the inheritance. I wasn't their father. I was the inconvenience sitting between them and the estate. I was a tenant in my own life, and they were just waiting for the lease to expire. It was 3:17 a.m. when I heard it. The sound was distinct, cutting through the silence of the hallway like a saw blade. It was the mechanical whir, click, whir of the laser printer in the home office down the hall. I lay still, listening. Caleb was always chasing some revolutionary investment scheme that required just a little more of my capital. Crypto farms, house flipping, tech startups that evaporated like mist. I assumed he was printing another prospectus, another desperate pitch to separate me from my pension. He was a man who had never learned the value of $1 because I had always given him 10. But the whirring stopped, and no footsteps followed. Silence reclaimed the house, thick and suffocating.
Driven by a curiosity I couldn't name, a judicial instinct that pricked at the back of my neck like a cold needle, I slipped out of bed. My joints ached, a constant, dull throb that reminded me of my 78 years, but I moved quietly. I had walked these floorboards for 50 years. I knew where they groaned and where they held their peace. I knew which floorboard on the landing screamed if you stepped on it, and which one was silent as the grave. I walked into the office. The room was empty, illuminated only by the standby light of the printer, blimping a slow, rhythmic green heartbeat. The smell of ozone and warm toner hung in the air. Sitting in the output tray was a single sheet of crisp white paper. It was still warm to the touch. I picked it up. The light from the street lamp outside filtered through the blinds, casting stripes of shadow across the page. I adjusted my reading glasses, which hung around my neck on a cord, a habit Eleanor had hated, but one I couldn't break. I read the text. Then I read it again. Certificate of death. State of New York. Name of decedent, Thomas Edward Sterling. Date of death, October 14th. I froze. The blood in my veins turned to ice slush, heavy and cold. I looked at the calendar on the wall, the one Eleanor used to mark birthdays on, the one I hadn't turned since she died. But I knew the date. Today was October 13th. According to this document, officially stamped and awaiting only a doctor's signature, I was scheduled to die tomorrow. I looked closer, my breath catching in my throat. Cause of death, myocardial infarction, heart attack. I stood there in the dark, holding my own obituary, printed on high-gloss paper. The warmth of the sheet seeped into my fingertips, a stark contrast to the chill spreading through my chest. I realized then that the vitamins my daughter-in-law gave me every morning, the ones that tasted like bitter metal and made my head swim, weren't meant to extend my life. They were preparing me for the end. They weren't caring for me.
They were culling me. I gripped the paper, the edges biting into my skin. If you've ever looked into the eyes of a loved one and seen a predator staring back, hit that subscribe button. You need to see how I survived my own execution. The shock threatened to buckle my knees. I reached out and gripped the edge of the mahogany desk to steady myself. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage.
For a moment, I felt like the frail old man they thought I was. I felt the urge to collapse, to weep, to call out for my son and ask him why. But then, the judge in me took over. The man who had stared down cartel bosses and serial killers pushed the terrified grandfather aside. The man who respected evidence above all else stepped forward. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a mistake. This was premeditation. This was murder in the first degree. I scanned the desk. It was cluttered with Caleb's chaotic paperwork, unpaid bills, foreclosure notices, gambling slips. But something caught my eye, hastily shoved under a stack of utility notices. I lifted the papers. Underneath lay a small glass vial and a sealed syringe. The label on the vial was stark white with black lettering, potassium chloride. My breath hitched. I knew what that was. I had presided over a medical malpractice case involving it 10 years ago. It stops the heart instantly. It mimics a massive heart attack, and unless a coroner knows specifically to look for it, it disappears into the body's chemistry within hours. They weren't waiting for nature. They weren't waiting for my bad heart to give out. They were going to stop it themselves. They were going to inject me, call a crooked doctor they had likely bribed, perhaps the name listed on the death certificate, Dr. Vane, and use this paper to bypass the autopsy and cremate me before the weekend. Flush. The sound of a toilet flushing upstairs roared through the pipes. Panic surged, hot and bright. Footsteps. Heavy, sleepy footsteps moving across the ceiling above me. Caleb. I couldn't confront them. Not yet. I was frail. Caleb was 35, desperate and strong. He had the desperation of a man drowning in debt, and I was just the raft he needed to cling to. If I confronted them now, holding the proof of their conspiracy, my heart attack wouldn't happen tomorrow. It would happen tonight, right here on the office rug. My hands trembled, but my mind was crystalline. I quickly pulled my phone from my robe pocket. I snapped a photo of the death certificate. I snapped a photo of the vial and syringe, making sure the label was legible. I placed the paper back in the tray, aligning it exactly as I found it. I slid the bills back over the vial. I retreated. I moved faster than I had in years, fueled by adrenaline. I slipped back into my room and locked the door. The click of the deadbolt sounded like a gunshot in the silent house.
I leaned against the door, gasping for breath. My heart was racing, skipping beats. For a terrifying second, I wondered if the poison was already in my system, if the vitamins had weakened me enough that fear alone would finish the job. I forced myself to breathe, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Count to 4. Hold for 4. Exhale for 4. I didn't sleep. I sat in my armchair by the window, watching the moon track across the sky, waiting for the sun to rise on the last day of my life. I formulated a defense. I cross-examined my own love for my son and found it guilty of blinding me. I looked at the photos on the wall, Caleb at graduation, Caleb at his wedding, and tried to reconcile that smiling boy with the man who printed my death date. At 7 a.m., the sun broke over the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. I unlocked the door. I had to play the part. I had to be the sheep they thought they were leading to the slaughter. I had to be the doting, oblivious father one last time. I showered. I dressed in my usual cardigan and slacks. I walked down the stairs, gripping the banister, listening to the domestic sounds from the kitchen, the blender whirring, coffee brewing, the sounds of a normal morning, masking the machinery of death. When I walked into the kitchen, Julianne was standing at the counter. She was wearing a silk robe I had bought her for Christmas. She turned and smiled, a bright, dazzling smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was a shark baring its teeth. "Come on, Thomas," she chirped. She held out a glass filled with a thick green sludge. "Drink up." I took the glass. It was cold. I brought it to my nose. It smelled of kale, apple, and a distinct metallic bitterness that I had learned to ignore over the last few months. "Thank you, dear," I said. My voice was steady. It didn't shake.
"We just want you around for a long time, Thomas," she said, patting my arm. "I know," I said. I turned toward the patio doors. "I think I'll drink it outside." "Don't stay out too long," she called after me. I stepped out onto the stone patio. The morning air was crisp. I walked to the edge of the garden, to the prize-winning rose bushes Eleanor had planted 40 years ago. They were the only living things in this house that I still trusted. I looked back at the house. Julianne was busy at the stove, humming a tune. I poured the green sludge into the dirt at the base of the red roses.
"Drink up," I whispered to the flowers. I needed an ally. I couldn't call the police yet. If I called 911 and said, "My son is going to kill me tomorrow," they would send a patrol car. Caleb would hide the vial. He would claim the certificate was a prank or a misunderstanding. They would see a senile old man making wild accusations against his loving caregivers. They would leave, and then I would be dead. I needed someone who knew how to bury bodies legally. I needed someone who knew that the law wasn't just about statutes, it was about leverage. I sat on the garden bench and dialed a number I hadn't called in 5 years. "Thorne," a gravelly voice answered on the second ring. Marcus Thorne, my old bailiff, a man built like a vending machine, with knuckles scarred from years of enforcing order in my courtroom. He was the only man I trusted to have my back in a knife fight. He was loyal to the bone, a man who saw the world in black and white, right and wrong. "Marcus," I whispered into the phone. I watched through the kitchen window as Caleb walked in. He kissed Julianne on the cheek. He laughed at something on his phone. He looked relaxed. He looked like a man who had already spent the money. "Marcus?" asked, his tone shifting instantly from gruff to alert. "No," I said. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. I need you to come over tonight. Park down the street." "My son," I said. The words tasted like ash. "Bring the recording equipment, the long-range stuff." "And Marcus?" There was a pause on the line, a heavy, loaded silence. "I'm legally dead as of tomorrow," I said, watching Caleb pour himself a cup of coffee. "I'm on my way," Marcus said. The line went dead. I put the phone away. A flashback hit me then, sudden and violent. Eleanor on her deathbed, her skin like parchment paper, gripping my hand with surprising strength. The monitors were beeping. Her eyes were cloudy, but for a moment they cleared. "Watch him, Thomas," she had whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Caleb has your eyes, but he has my father's greed. He always wants the shortcut." I hadn't listened. I had thought it was the morphine talking. I had thought she was delirious. I had chastised her for speaking ill of our son. I wiped a tear from my cheek. "You were right, Elle," I whispered to the wind. I spent the afternoon playing the ghost in my own machine. I sat in the living room pretending to read a book, but I was watching. I was documenting. I waited until they were in the backyard, discussing where they would put the new pool. I slipped into the office. I accessed the computer. I checked the browser history. How to stage a heart attack. Potassium chloride detection window. Cremation services same day. Probate lawyers cheap. I took photos of the screen. I was gathering the rope they would use to hang themselves. I went to the hidden wall safe behind the painting in the library. I spun the dial. They had been trying to crack it for months. I had seen the scratch marks on the dial, but they didn't know the combination was the date of my first trial, not my birthday. I opened it. The will was there. The original deed. .38 revolver. I didn't take the gun. I left it. I didn't want to shoot my son. I wanted to destroy him. I wanted to dismantle him in the way I knew best, with the cold, hard weight of the law. At 6 p.m., Caleb came into the living room. He was jittery. He kept tapping his leg. He looked like he was vibrating with nervous energy. "Dad," he said. His voice was too loud, too bright. "Julian and I were thinking, we should have a nice family dinner tomorrow night. Just us." I looked up from my book. "A celebration?" Caleb hesitated. He licked his lips. "Just life. We want to celebrate you, Dad. Everything you've done for us." "That sounds lovely," I said. I closed the book with a snap. "Great," Caleb said. "Great." He walked away. I looked at the date on my watch. October 13th. The clock was ticking. They were planning the murder for dinner, the poisoned meal, the toast to my health that would end it. I had 24 hours to turn the table, 24 hours to rewrite the ending of this story, or the paper on the printer would become a prophecy, and Thomas Sterling would cease to exist. I stood up. My knees popped. My back ached. But my
My heart was beating a steady, furious rhythm. Let them set the table. I was going to serve the main course. The dining room was a stage set for a funeral, but they thought it was a party. The air was heavy, stagnant with the scent of roasted garlic and the suffocating perfume Julian had doused herself in to cover the stench of her own anxiety. I watched them from the head of the table, feeling the familiar weight of the judicial robe settling onto my shoulders. The black fabric was heavy, smelling faintly of cedar and old courtrooms, a scent that used to mean authority, but tonight felt like wrong armor.
It was the only barrier between my frail, aging body and the predators sitting less than 4 feet away. Caleb had insisted on using the good china, Eleanor's wedding china, the delicate bone porcelain with the gold rim that she had saved for Christmases, anniversaries, and graduations. Seeing it now, laid out for a meal designed to end my life, felt like a physical violation. It was a desecration of her memory, a final insult before they swept my ashes into the wind to clear space for their new lives. Caleb and Julianne were dressed up. He wore a suit that was too tight across the shoulders, a sheen of sweat already slicking his forehead despite the cool temperature of the house. She wore a cocktail dress that was inappropriate for a quiet family dinner, her eyes darting around the room, landing on everything but me. They radiated nervous energy, vibrating with it like heat waves off asphalt in July. I sat still. I kept my hands folded on the table, burying the tremor in my fingers beneath the wide sleeves of the robe. I watched them. I studied them the way I used to study defendants before passing sentence, looking for the crack in the veneer. Caleb asked. His laugh was forced, a sharp, barking sound that cracked in the middle. He picked up the bottle of expensive Cabernet, my Cabernet, and poured it into the crystal glasses. His hand shook so violently that a drop of red splashed onto the pristine white tablecloth. I watched the stain spread, dark and ominous. It looked like a Ben-shot wound blooming on a clean shirt. I felt like presiding tonight, I said. My voice was calm, measured, the voice I used when reading a verdict to a packed courtroom. Caleb froze for a second, the bottle hovering over my glass. He exchanged a quick, terrified glance with Julianne. She looked away, her lips pressed into a thin, white line, her fingers twisting the napkin in her lap. Come on, Dad. It's just dinner. Relax. Julianne walked in from the kitchen, carrying a silver tureen. The steam rising from it smelled rich and earthy. She placed a bowl in front of me with exaggerated care, treating me like a toddler who might knock it over. Eat up, Thomas, she said, her voice tight, pitchy. It's mushroom bisque, your favorite. I made it special. I looked down at the soup. It was thick, creamy, flecked with herbs. It smelled delicious. It smelled like earth and cream and murder. I wondered how much they had put in it. Was it the digitalis from my heart medication? Or had they used the potassium chloride I found in the office? Enough to stop a horse, I imagined. This was it. The execution meal. The last supper before the inheritance cleared. I pushed the bowl away, the china scraping loudly against the polished wood of the table. I'm not hungry, I said. You have to eat, Caleb snapped. The facade cracked instantly. His eyes went wide and desperate. You haven't eaten all day. I looked up at him. I locked eyes with my son, the boy I had taught to ride a bike, the man I had bailed out of debt 3 times, the child Eleanor had adored. I searched for him in those eyes, but I found only a stranger. Eleanor, I asked softly. The silence that slammed into the room was absolute. It was heavy enough to crush bone. The clock on the mantel ticked, tock, 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 marking the seconds of their unraveling. Julianne took a step back, her hand going to her throat as if she couldn't breathe. What? She whispered. I found the paper, Caleb, I said. I didn't raise my voice. I dropped it. I dropped it into that deep, resonant baritone that had silenced unruly courtrooms for 40 years. It was a voice that commanded attention, a voice that did not ask for permission. The one on the printer, I continued, watching the color drain from his face until he looked like a corpse himself. My death certificate.
Thomas, Edward, Sterling. Date of death, October 14th. Caleb stood up so fast his chair flew backward, scraping violently against the floorboards before toppling over. He looked like a cornered animal, eyes darting to the doors, the windows. "You're confused, Dad. You're seeing things again. Your mind is going." I roared. I slammed my open palm onto the table. The silverware rattled, the water glasses shook. He froze. He hadn't heard that voice since he was a teenager caught stealing $20 from my wallet. It was the voice of the law. It was the voice of consequences. He sank back into his chair, not bothering to pick it up, just perching on the edge of the seat as if ready to bolt. "I am not confused," I said, leaning forward, the black robes billowing around me. "And I am not blind. I know about the gambling debts, Caleb, the online poker, the crypto losses. Dad, I know about the liens on your business," I continued, relentless, hammering him with the facts like a prosecutor delivering a closing argument.
I know you borrowed $50,000 from a loan shark in Jersey who is threatening to break your legs if you don't pay by Monday. That's why you need the insurance money now, isn't it? That's why you can't wait for nature to take its course. Julian started to tremble. Her glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor, shards of crystal spraying across the rug. She didn't even look down. "He knows," she whimpered, her voice rising to a hysteric pitch. "He knows everything." Caleb shouted, sweat pouring down his face, soaking his collar. "He's making it up. He's senile." Julianne screamed, her face twisting into a mask of pure panic. She pointed at me, her fingers shaking. "Just do it now. We don't have a choice." Caleb looked at her, then at me. His eyes were wild, dilated with fear and adrenaline. He reached into his jacket pocket. He didn't pull out a gun. He didn't pull out a knife. He pulled out a syringe. It was already uncapped, the needle glinting in the chandelier light like a sliver of ice. He lunged across the table. He screamed, tears streaming down his face. "I don't have a choice. They'll kill me." I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I sat in my chair, robed in black, and watched my son try to kill me. I watched the boy I raised decide that my life was the price of his mistakes. "You always had a choice," I said, my voice cutting through his screams. The needle was inches from my arm. I could see the clear liquid inside. I could see the pores on his face. Then, the world exploded. The front door burst open with a crash that shook the entire house. The wood splintered. "Police! Drop it!" Marcus stepped into the dining room. He didn't look like a retired bailiff tonight. He looked like a tank. His service weapon was drawn, steady as a rock, aimed directly at Caleb's chest. Behind him, 2 uniformed officers and the county sheriff flooded the room, their boots thudding on hardwood, their radios crackling with static. I had signaled Marcus via a text message the moment the soup was served. Verdict is in. Caleb froze. The syringe hovered in the air, caught between intent and consequence. He looked at the gun barrel. He looked at the police. He looked at me. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The trap hadn't been for me. It had been for him. The lamb had lured the wolf. "Drop the weapon, son," the sheriff barked. "Now." Caleb's hand opened. The syringe fell.
It hit the floor with a clatter and rolled under the table, coming to rest next to the shattered wine glass. He collapsed. He fell back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. A sound ripped out of him, a jagged, ugly sob that sounded like something tearing. It wasn't the sound of remorse. It wasn't the sound of regret. It was the sound of a coward who had realized there was no way out. Julianne tried to run. She bolted for the back door, her heels clicking frantically on the floor, slipping on the spilled wine. "Marcus!" she shouted. 2 officers intercepted her before she reached the kitchen. They grabbed her arms. She screamed, kicking and thrashing, her dress tearing. "You senile old bat!" she shrieked, her face contorted with hate as they cuffed her. She looked at me with eyes that were black holes of malice. "You tricked us!"